things I left off. That particularly those two Chinese philosophers. Now back on chapter 10, before we go to chapter 11. The Chinese philosophers, the one of them I really want you to remember was Wang Yangming. I put his name down last time, but he said that the way to understand the material world was by understanding self. Now, again, I cannot emphasize enough about these philosophers. You put some of their philosophies in the modern world, and they just simply fall apart. They just somehow seem to not measure up. And a lot of persons believe that these philosophers, without them knowing it, without them intending to, wound up holding the Chinese people back and kept them from developing technology and science and a modern-day economy. It's a lot of the China's problem stemmed from its philosophers, which they did not realize at the time. The philosophers didn't, and neither did the people who listened to them, did not realize that these philosophies were going to guarantee that they only got so far in the area of science and technology and would never go out and expand any higher. Now, something else I want to mention about China that I thought about during the class, and then into the class without mentioning, about Chinese family life. During times of poverty, the Chinese often killed their female babies because they felt like women were just of less importance. Now, this practice was to be repeated in the 20th century when the Chinese government issued a proclamation that couples can only have 2 children per couple. This was to keep the population down. And a lot of the couples then resorted to killing their female babies. Now, folk, I have a hard time believing this, but nevertheless, I mean, I've been told. How many of you have heard this from outside source, by any chance? Okay, several hands went up, so I'm not telling you anything that I'm making up. I mean, it is in a book that the Chinese sometimes killed their female babies in time of poverty, in time of famine. But they did it in the 20th century, and with the idea to keep the male line going, and they didn't realize somehow that if they didn't produce females, they weren't going to have males. The male line was not going to continue anyway. And what happened was a lot of Chinese young men grew up and couldn't find wives. Anyway, the Chinese also would sometimes sell their women to be prostitutes, their daughters. In other words, Chinese fathers would sell their daughters to be prostitutes or showgirls if they were attractive enough, or would sell them out as slaves. Your book calls them domestic servants, what amounted to nothing more than sheer slavery, where they're alive. In other words, basically, you get the feeling that the fathers did not have a whole lot of love for their daughters, at least not by Western standards of love, or Western idea of love. All right. Again, I forgot to mention that last time, so I thought I'd pick up loose ends. And I always end a class and think, oops, I forgot to say this. Oops, I forgot that. Get in my car and realize, oops, I should have said this. But anyway, so much for that. All right, and now to chapter 11. If you were to see a multiple choice test question, and I ask you what are the 4 Japanese islands, and one of the choices was Okinawa, what would you do? Pick another choice. I mean, it's just simply, okay, one of the choices is Okinawa. Don't go with that one. No, think about multiple choice. Sometimes you can eliminate one answer as being ridiculous or another answer as being ridiculous. Now, you can't always eliminate ridiculous. And I want to say this about multiple choice. When I have a choice of none of the, I'm trying to get rid of all my none of the above or all of the above answers, but none of the above is not necessarily the right answer. Much too often I've done that and made all of the above or none of the above the right answers. But it's not necessarily going to be the right. There's at least going to be one all of the above question on that next test. be forewarned. Anyway, 4 Japanese islands. The fact that Japan consists of these islands sometimes made unity a little bit difficult. I mean, it wasn't like they could just get on a horse and gallop across from one island to another. But Japanese, like the Chinese, remained, actually the thing that kept Japan unified was the threat of China more than anything else. They feared that China would come in and try to conquer them, which China did several times, but China was never able to. And again, the ocean barrier served as a big barrier. The most serious threat came from the Emperor Kublai Khan, and I've mentioned how that Kublai Khan tried to conquer them in a divine wind setup. Now, something else about Japan, their emperor. Japan is the only nation on earth whose present dynasty goes back at least 2,600 years. Their emperors have governed father to son, father to son, father to son for about 2,600 years. And one of the reasons is the emperor was looked on as being divine. That's a big part of their religion. And a few Japanese people today still believe this. During World War II, this was a big issue. The other thing that's kept the emperors alive, believe it or not, is that most of them have been nothing more than mere figureheads with no real actual authority. They've been like the Queen of England, has the title. Now, the Queen of England can trace her ancestry back to a historical figure named Cerdic, who lived around 400, about the time of Clovis of France. Cerdic is known to have been an actual historical figure. And then, if you believe the mythologies, she can trace her ancestry all the way back to Adam. Cerdic, we have some idea who Cerdic's father was and grandfather, and that whole line of kings that ruled before they even came to Britain. They were a line of chieftains of their tribes. That goes all the way back through Noah and then to Adam. But again, if you can believe the mythologies, I'll call them mythologies for lack of a better word. But anyway, the Japanese believe their emperor is divine. And therefore, nobody would touch that office. The only way to be emperor is to be born in it. So nobody ever set up a coup to overthrow the emperor. In fact, the main reason Japan was slow at surrendering during World War II was they tried to get the United States to agree that, hey, if we surrender, we promise that we'll leave the emperor alone. The United States said, we won't agree to anything. We want an unconditional surrender. Japan finally surrendered unconditionally. And the United States left the office of emperor alone. Except General MacArthur took over Tokyo, and instead of him going to the emperor came to him, which was a sign to the Japanese that the emperor is subservient to MacArthur. MacArthur did tell him that you have to renounce your claim to divinity, which the emperor did. Some Japanese still believe he's divine, though. In modern times, though, now the other thing about the emperor, in modern time, the emperor is little thought of. That's what I started to say. But the other thing about the emperor, the Japanese still keep time based on the accession year of the emperor. Now, the present emperor took over around 1989, I believe, which means that this would be something like year 26 on the Japanese calendar. Again, I don't know when their new year is, but something like that, around year 25 or 26 of this particular emperor. His father was the emperor during World War II, and he lasted about 50 years as emperor. He got the throne as a young man and lived to be very old. And this emperor might live a long time also. Anyway, back to the time period we're talking about, though. Japan's climate is moderate, called temperate, as opposed to being polar or tropical. And I must say this, folks, because it's simply the matter of telling it the way I observed it, the way others observed it too. People who live in the tropics tend to be less industrious than persons who live in temperate climates. And don't ask me why that is. Tropical people generally do not advance as highly technologically or culturally as people who live in temperate climates. So Japan's climate is temperate. That means it has 4 seasons, summer, a fall, a winter, and a spring. most of the Japanese people live on the East Coast because the East Coast has all the harbors. I mean, a harbor is shaped like a piece of puzzle. And the West Coast, on the other hand, of most Japan has a nice, smooth, beach-like coast where you can't shelter ships that well on a beach. So most of Japan's people then live on the East Coast, even though China actually lies to the west. Nevertheless, Japan would send its ships, when they traded with China or Korea, they'd send their ships on the eastern side and go around the island and wind up in the western part. Now, something else that Japan has had a problem with all throughout history, the last one of these being just 4 years ago, I believe, earthquakes. The Earth sits on several tectonic plates, and sometimes these tectonic plates come together at certain points. And every once in a while, they'll move. And people who live in the area where the plate moves, the people who live right in the middle of a tectonic plate, the Earth can shift a little bit, and they won't even feel it or notice it. We've had a few mild earthquakes here, and the last one, the one that I felt, was in 2003. We've had a few of them since. One of them that we had felt here actually did damage to the Washington Monument, but anyway, that they wound up repairing, spending a few years repairing. Anyway, in the case of Japanese, though, they have probably the worst earthquakes in the world, and these earthquakes sometimes trigger tidal waves, or sometimes they're otherwise called tsunamis, massive tidal waves. And the last one sent a tidal wave over a part of the island that actually went over some of their nuclear power plants and made some of the area, the grassland area around them, radioactive, and it would be radioactive for several years. We don't know how many. But they have had a problem with earthquakes, and it's just something they learn to live with. Now, the Japanese have a creation myth. They say the world was created by the marriage of a god and a goddess. The difference, so that what makes this creation myth unique is that most people who believe this are generally considered primitive. The Japanese, though, this creation myth is unique, and it still believe of people whom I have to consider advanced, technologically advanced, and it has survived until modern times. And this myth is the basis of making the emperor divine, because the emperor claims that he is descended from the god and goddess who created the world to begin with. All right. The first people we know about are the Jomon. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but probably close. The Jomon were said to have been farmers. Now, they came in around the year, about the time of Christ. You might wonder, why was Japan not inhabited before this time? Some people believe that Japan sits on the top of volcanic islands like Hawaii, and that these islands did not exist until about 2,000 or so years ago, when volcanic action pushed the islands up out of the sea. And then eventually these islands became habitable. At first, of course, it had been nothing but volcanic ash, but then the topsoil was set in. And then animals found their way over there, and then people moved in. Plant life was probably carried, seeds were carried by birds. And eventually the area became habitable. The Jomon have believed to have been primitive, lived by hunting and fishing. However, today more research has led us to believe that they actually mastered the art of agriculture. The next group of people were I don't know, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce this, so I'll write it down. Yayoi, I guess I'll attempt to pronounce it. But most Japanese people today know that they're descended from the Yayoi. Anyway, what we know about the Yayoi, they tended to form around small tribes with a chieftain. The chieftain would claim that he was descended from the gods. Eventually, one of these chieftains became the supreme ruler about the year 2600 or so before, 600, probably about the year 600 before Christ, or 2600 years ago. One of the rulers claimed that he was descended from the gods, and his descendants are still on the throne of Japan today. Even though I can't emphasize enough how the Japanese emperor's authority never equaled that of the Chinese emperors. And in fact, for the most part, the most part of the Japanese rulers ruled as figureheads, and the actual governing was done by prime ministers. Well, the office of the emperor, though, did do something for the Japanese. It made them more centralized. Now, the history of Japan, up until in modern times, is a history of a pendulum, like going back and forth. At times, there was a strong central government. Then, when it fell out with the central government, they go back to ruling where local governments would become powerful. Then, when the local governments would start fighting each other and civil wars would break out, the people would go back and demand a strong central government. And the pendulum has swung back and forth throughout most of history. I won't go into detail about which years that they had a strong central government, which years they had local rulers, but they tended to go back and forth. Now, eventually, to deal with the problem, right? In the case of Japan, farmland is a pretty rare commodity. Only about 12% of the land can be farmed. The rest of it, the farming is made difficult due to mountains. Now, the mountains in Japan are steep and rugged, again, owing to the fact that Japan was created by volcanic ash spewing up. And by the way, volcanic ash does make good farmland, but then when it's on a mountainside, it's difficult owing to the fact that rains will wash the soil away, for one. And for another, mountain land can get very little sunshine, maybe for 2 or 3 hours a day of good sunshine. The rest of the time it's in the shadow. And all this makes farming difficult. And then even farming in the valleys between the mountains blocks out the sun a large part of the day. And again, all this makes farming difficult. But they had the same problem everybody else had. Eventually, the land would be taken over by the rich. So what they wound up doing to solve it was they said all farmland is going to be owned by the state. And all taxes were to be paid directly to the central government. And what this did, folk, for the people of Japan was introduce the idea that everything is centralized. So the state owns all the good land. The state owns all the good land. Taxes go directly to the state, not through your local governments. And all this was to lead to Japan having a highly autocratic authority, which ultimately, all right, nobody knows which path they're taking will lead, but looking back on it, where this led Japan to was they sided with the autocrats in World War II. They sided with Hitler and Mussolini in World War II because they did not understand the concept of democracy. Buddhism was introduced, but a lot of Japanese did not like Buddhism. The same reason that China has it, hey, we can invent our own religion, or we can make our own. Buddhism is a foreign religion. And they used the same logic, by the way, when Christianity was introduced. So, what happened, though, they got together, some of them, and they formed a new religion called Shinto. Shinto is the Japanese reaction to Buddhism, to try to keep Buddhism at bay, and it did incorporate some of the elements of Buddhism. Now, I have a niece who, when she was in college, asked me to help her to give some ideas because the topic she was assigned was Japanese religion. And I must state this about the Japanese and their religious beliefs. They are the most indifferent people on the face of the earth to their religion. And you talk to a lot of Japanese today, they have no religious beliefs hardly whatever. And but their religion, such as it was, centered around Shintoism. And as I've already mentioned, Shintoism taught them that the emperor was divine. And it did have a few other beliefs, which I'll get into in a little bit. Particularly the tea ceremony. Oh yes, beauty. They believed that their gardens should be decorative and bring out the beauty of nature in their gardens. So their homes were surrounded by a whole lot of flower gardens. All a part of their religion. Now this centralization, like I said, the centralization of the state eventually decentralized as the pendulum swung back and forth as they got tired of. When they decentralized, they fought each other. When they were centralized, they fought the state, the central authority. And they did not necessarily like any form of government that they had very long. They copied the Chinese civil service exams. Civil service exams, but only the nobles could take them. They were closed to the common people. Now your book talks about the shogunate system. I'm not going to ask you to learn that. The lead man who set it up, Yoritomo, I'm not going to ask you to learn his name. But the shogunate system was a system they used to ward off the threat of the Mongolians or Chinese taking over the country. The Mongolians tried to take over, the Chinese tried to take over, never worked. Now, a disease that has affected humanity, and it makes news from time to time. Suppose we wiped it out. Smallpox. Smallpox. Smallpox found its way into Japan eventually, and it wiped out a large segment of the population. Smallpox is something that has hit all of humanity at one point or another. But when it hit the American Indians, it really hit them hard, and it's believed to have helped wipe out 90% of the Indian population. Really hard. And it came to Japan from China, and China probably got it from the Middle East. And the Middle East, it might have started in Africa, but we don't know for sure where it started from. We do know that supposedly the disease has been eliminated. And at one time, everybody in America had these 6 little needle holes on their arm. Yes, I have one. For several generations, because this was the way you got vaccinated against smallpox. Today, I'm not sure that they even vaccinate against smallpox because supposedly the disease has died out. I had 2 smallpox vaccinations, one when I was 6, and one when I was 30 years old and joined the Army. I was still vaccinating against smallpox in 1980, 35 years ago now. Whether they still do or not, I don't know. But anyway, smallpox hit Japan and wiped out a big part of the Japanese population. We now know that persons who worked among cattle tended to not get smallpox, but Japanese had very, very little cattle owing to the fact that their land just simply was not conducive to cattle farming. They did have some. They did have a group of soldiers called samurai. These are like the equivalent of the European armored knights. Both the European knights and the samurai would fight from horseback. The difference was European knights fought with spears and swords. The Japanese samurai usually fought with bows and arrows, and it took a lot of practice, a lot of skill, a lot of training to shoot an arrow accurately from the back of a horse. It could be done, but unless you've had a lot of training and experience at it, it's difficult to do, but they would shoot their arrows from the horse's back while the horse was at full gallop. By the way, full gallop. And again, reminds me our tanks today can go at full speed and hit a target because our tank gunners are using computers to zero in on a target. And once the gun operator has programmed a tank turret to that target, the tank might be bouncing along on a rough road up and down, but the computer will keep the tank shooting right at that target. Again, without the gunner having any particular skill at aiming. But that's the 21st century, back to the time we're talking about. In spite of their civil service exams, which only the nobility could take, the Japanese nobility held on to their offices. Sometimes a nobleman, if he felt like his oldest son was particularly incompetent, might bypass his oldest son for a younger son if the oldest son fell out of favor. But for the most part, they held on. But the civil service exam would sometimes force a father to bypass maybe an older one or two sons because the third or fourth son had a higher civil service score. It didn't happen all the time. Mostly the nobility held on to their authority. Now, of all of their social classes, one thing I remember, the only thing I remember is the ETA that were at the bottom, ETA. These were comparable to the Indian untouchables. These were at the very, very bottom of society and generally had little chance of bettering themselves or moving up. Now, as time went on, some of the people from other classes were allowed to take the civil service exam. You know, it is difficult to make a blanket statement that applies to all generations and all localities, but so some of the poorer people could better themselves. The ETA, never. They were kept at the bottom, just like the Indian untouchables. They just felt like, hey, we need somebody who does the dirty work that the higher ones among us do not want to do. So the Japanese kept their lower class people as untouchables. Now, I've got to insert this, folk. I'm trying to talk about the untouchables or the bottom people. The United States is made up of outcasts from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Persons who would not have had any chance to better themselves in Europe. Now, personally, I'm not the least bit hesitant to tell you that I'm descended from a penniless immigrant named John Cunningham, who came over here with nothing. Am I embarrassed about that? I mean, not in the least. And if he had stayed in the old world, and if I were still in the old world, I'd probably have not much more than, very little more than nothing. I really believe that we could have taken these untouchables, put them on a separate continent, and they could have, with the right kind of guidance, the right constitution, the right Bill of Rights, the right kind of democracy, they could have made the greatest nation the world had ever seen. Again, if you're descended from some penniless immigrant or some penniless outcast from another continent, don't feel bad. That's what America made itself out of. The dregs of Europe, the dregs of Asia, the dregs of Africa, the people who did not fit in at their old homeland came here and mostly bettered themselves. All right. Now, Japanese religion. They emphasize bodily cleanliness, natural beauty, divinity of the emperor. Now, the state was looked on as being holy. Now, folk, before you think this is primitive, as recently as the 1930s, Mussolini, who ruled Italy, said the state is holy and incapable of making a mistake. Could never be immoral, the state was always morally above making a mistake, above committing an immoral act. There were some rituals. The rituals that they performed were usually performed in front of a shrine or a holy place. And again, a lot of stress was placed on natural beauty, beautifying your gardens, beautifying your flower beds, beautifying the area around your house, by planting flowers, keeping up the place, trimming the flowers, the plant life often. Now, one other thing about Japan, and I'll leave them. I don't talk much about literature, but the one thing I must mention about Japan, the linked verse haiku. Now, folk, when I was in the 10th grade, our teacher asked us to construct a haiku poem. I couldn't do it. Now, hopefully all of you run into that word before somewhere in your literature classes. Essentially, I understand it consists of so many syllables on the first line and so many in the second line. And then there's a third line. The third line usually, it's like the first two lines want to jerk, they lead you in one direction, and the third line jerks you in the other direction. I mean, that's the impression I get of haiku. If any of you know more about it than I do, your comments are welcome. Have you run into this word before by any chance? Okay, several heads are nodding. Yeah, here's somebody who's seen it before. But it's Japanese linked verse. So many syllables in the first line, so many in the second line, and then it consists of 3 lines. Korea. Korea is located on a peninsula just off the coast of China. Now, here's the thing about Korea that I want you to remember because it applies to today. Most of its history, Korea has been divided with the sides fighting each other. Most of the time it's been divided into 3 nations independent of each other, but sometimes 2. And that applies to today because as of now, April 8th, 2015, Korea is still divided into North and South. The Koreans have been strongly influenced by China. We do not know where the Korean people came from. Now, folk, when I was a kid, they would teach us that the Korean people are racially not connected to any other people on Earth. Since we've studied DNA, we now know this to not be true. But we still cannot tell where they came from. They appear to not be Far Eastern. So I don't know if they're Indo-European or if they're Oriental, but now they say, some of them say, that they came from another planet and settled in that part of the world. Now, no, I do not in any way believe that, but nevertheless, folks, I have heard it, and which would explain why that they are racially not attached to any other race of people. They were one time considered a race all to themselves, but today we know, hey, there's only one race, the human race, and this is brought out by DNA. And yes, they are related to the rest of us. So no, they did not come from another planet. Like Japan, Korea is mountainous and difficult to farm. Now when I say there's a farm, what good farmland there is in the north. Most of the south is mountainous and the soil is not all that great either, and it's difficult to farm. Now, I just said the north had all the good farmland, the south has the bad farmland. Today, the north is starving and the south is prospering. You might say, how can that be? Well, the north adopted communism and the south adopted capitalism. When the people of the south grew, hey, we can't farm, they became industrialized, and they started making automobiles and electronic devices and whatever. They copied the Japanese and industrialized, and the north is starving. By the way, the north blames all their problems on the United States. It's our fault. Maybe you think so too, and if you do, I won't argue. You're welcome to say so. I won't argue with you. I like to speak. Anyway, Korea has been conquered a few times through its history by China, particularly the Han Dynasty conquered them, Japan conquered them, and Korea has gone back and forth oftentimes between Japan on the one side and China on the other. Actually, in a lot of ways, Japan is closer to Korea than China, even though on the map it looks like China's joined. But actually, to get from most of China to Korea, you have to cross the ocean, unless you want to go all the way around to get to the landmass. So Japan is actually, in some ways, closer to Korea than China is. As the Han Dynasty declined, the Korean people rose up and drove out the Chinese. But after they'd driven out the Chinese, they could not unite. They formed three kingdoms. I'm not going to ask you to learn their names. But the three kingdoms were all strongly influenced by China, much more so than by Japan. Buddhism came into Korea, as did Confucianism. And unlike Japan and China, in the case of Korea, Buddhism became the dominant religion. And you might ask, what religion did the Koreans have before then? It was mostly animism, or primitive religions that civilized people tend to get rid of as they become more civilized, or the people as they become more civilized tend to lay aside. Shamanism and animism, spirit worship, nature worship, pantheism. These are generally religions for primitive people that more civilized people would put aside. Anyway, Buddhism eventually became the state religion of all of Korea's states. Now, fast forward to the year 2015, and South Korea is the most Christian nation on the face of the earth, with half of its people being Christian, the other half just about all Buddhist. It's like half and half, but I say the most Christian. South Korea on any Sunday has the highest percentage of people attending a Christian church than any other nation on the face of the earth. I just have to throw that in because this is, in other words, somehow the Koreans did not have an adversity to adopting foreign religions. Now, the Koreans made the same mistake that a lot of people have made when land started getting in the hands of a few wealthy landowners. The Korean government stepped in, broke up the big estates, and redistributed the land equally among the poor. And it simply failed, and it wound up bringing down the government when the government collapsed, owing to the fact that the people felt like, hey, you know, we were expecting we were going to be treated as equals. They'd get the land and somehow not know how to manage or deal with it. All right. I made a hard speech at the end of last class about helping the poor. I want to clarify something. It is not the government's place to help the poor. Now, for you as an individual to help some poor brother or sister, hey, that's a virtue. That's great. That's wonderful. But to expect the government to do it, every time it happens, it winds up bringing governments down. Look, I mean, all right, I'll tell you, just a few semesters ago, during the 2008 election, in fact, I was teaching in the fall of 2008. No, it was the fall of 2012, during the last election. And one person wrote a paper that he strongly would support the candidate who he believed would help the poor because he believed that's what the title of the paper was, "Who would Jesus vote for?" And he believed strongly Jesus Christ would vote for the candidate who would help the poor. In other words, a Democrat. I didn't give him a little grade, but I wrote back, Jesus Christ did not ever advocate governments or Caesar helping the poor. It's to be done by each of us individually. Now, if you don't like what I've said, I'll be quiet. I'll sit back and I'll listen, and you can say your piece. Anybody have any thoughts on it? I mean, you know. But anyway, here's an example. The Silla government, I'm not asking to learn that name, but I do want you to remember that the Silla government tried to help the poor by taking lands from the rich and redistributing them. The poor who had received the lands without paying for them quickly lost them. Folks, this is a bad habit that people have. Now, if they'd been required to pay for the land, they might have kept them. Now, in 1862, Russia freed 15 million serfs. So they were given land on what we say, similar to what we have, on easy terms. So you and your children and grandchildren can spend 50 years paying off the nobles. So the serfs had to pay for the land. But the nobles were required to sell it. In other words, it said to each nobleman, that you sell your serfs a plot of land for so much, and give them, for 50 years, they must pay you. And then, by the way, this worked. Most of the serfs were able to keep their land once they got it, until the state took over in 1917 and took over all the land. So even that didn't really work, you might say, but it worked better than just outright giving. Because when people are handed out, they become dependents on the government. They expect the government's going to always bail them out. And eventually the government runs out of money. Folk, I mean, this is standard history. And what I'm telling you is in your book, by the way. Anyway, eventually Civil War came about as a result of this. Out of the Civil War came the Koryo dynasty, from which we get the name Korea. Now, Korea and Saudi Arabia, Saudi is a family that rules. Saudi Arabia and Korea is the only two countries that are named after the ruling family, the only two I know of. In the case of Korea, the Koryo dynasty died out hundreds of years ago, but the Koryo dynasty was to rule for 400 years. And they were to actually have Korea mostly united during this time. The Chinese were weaker than during the Koryo period. That helped the Koreans because the Chinese never felt strong enough to come in and take over. This was during the Sung dynasty we talked about. And also the Great Wall that kept the Mongolians out of China also helped keep the Mongolians out of Korea. So Korea didn't have any problem from abroad, but instead their own nobility rose up and weakened the power of the central government. And the army wound up taking over. And then when this happened, the Mongolians conquered China and they took over. And the Koreans were forced into poverty. Now, fast forward to the 20th century, Korea became known as the Hermit Kingdom because they believed that all foreigners ever done for us is destroy us, fight against us, and they tried to keep foreigners out and isolate themselves. Today, they're not called that. Today, they're big traders. The Hyundai and the Kia are made in Korea, and Hyundai and Kia sell a lot of cars in the United States. Generally, I think, fairly high-quality automobiles, if any of you happen to be driving one. Anyway, eventually the Koreans drove the Mongolians out and became in charge of their own destiny, and here's where we take leave of them. To make a long story short, the next hundreds of years, Korea was destined to be passed back and forth between China and Japan on the one hand, or fighting among each other on the other, and had one trouble after another. All right. Vietnam. If you look on some of the old maps dating in the 1940s, and yes, when I grew up, I'd look at a lot of those maps. You don't find them much anymore, but they would show Vietnam was not even on a map. It was called French Indochina because the French had taken it over. But in fact, I didn't even hear of Vietnam until we got involved in a war with them around 1962 or 63. Before that, it was always on a map as the French Indochina. The earliest people, though, we know about were the Viets. The Viets began farming in the Red River Valley. Now, I say this about the Red River Valley. Our soldiers would dread it because between the Red River Valley and its Mekong Delta, that was where a lot of our young men died during the Vietnam era. Vietnam had to struggle against China. Now, unlike Korea and Japan, and to some extent unlike China, Vietnam is a tropical. And yes, I have said it already today, tropical peoples tend to advance less technologically in other ways. Nevertheless, now the Viets, when the Chinese came, the Chinese outnumbered them greatly and initially defeated them. But the Viets did not take it lying down. They went to the mountains, and then they would swoop down in the mountains and harass the Chinese. The Vietnamese have a history of defeating their enemies by guerrilla tactics. And folk in the 20th century, just in my lifetime, in 1954, when I was 5 years old, They defeated the French and drove the French out of the country. So the United States stepped in to force them away from their own destiny, and they defeated the United States. This you'll find in your history. Most of you probably heard that already. Hopefully you have. I mean, it's a blot in the United States history. But the Chinese initially tried to take over Vietnam, and they lost. I mean, well, China actually held on to Vietnam for 1,000 years. The Chinese were, they didn't quit. They kept on coming. Unlike the French who quit, the Chinese kept on coming back, and they held Vietnam for about 1,000 years. And then the Chinese began the process of Sinification. In other words, the Chinese felt like the reason we conquered you in the first place was to civilize you, to bring you up to our cultural level. So they began to make the Vietnamese like the Chinese. Vietnam became a part of China. That's why on the old maps it appears as Indochina. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism spread. And a lot of Vietnamese to this day belong to one of those religions or another. Buddhism became the dominant one, by the way. Much more so than Taoism and Confucian. Before this, the Vietnamese had believed in nature spirits. Again, primitive people tend to believe in nature spirits. Then when they become more civilized, they embrace one of the other religions. And in this case, most of them went from nature spirit worship, and it was animism, to Buddhism. Now, there was something else the Vietnamese were doing. And again, if you want to comment, you can. But the Vietnamese couples would simply marry without the benefit of a ceremony. If a couple decided they liked each other enough to marry, they would just simply start living together. Probably the wife would move into the husband's house, and they lived together with no ceremony. The Chinese people said, hey, this is uncivilized. You should not live together without the benefit of a ceremony to where your marriage has legal status, and then you get more respect than you do now. This might be a hot issue with some of you, but I want to state, and if it steps on anybody's toes, I'm not going to apologize for it. Generally, persons who go through a wedding ceremony before they live together are looked on with more respect than people who just simply start living together without the benefit of the ceremony. The Chinese thought so, and a lot of your civilized people have thought so down through time. But the Vietnamese eventually learned that to please the Chinese, and also they learned the benefits of it too. Their couple should have a ceremony, a wedding, in other words, before they started living together. Anyway, the Viets fought the Chinese off and on for 1,000 years, and one of the people who led them was a woman. I had a student some years back do a paper on her. But this woman valiantly led her people against the Chinese, but she lost. Anyway, eventually Vietnam was able to drive the Chinese out. Then came the Mongolians. The Mongolians came down to conquer the Viets, but the Mongolians did even less well than the Chinese had. The Mongolians were fighting from horseback, galloping horses, and in a formation. This type of fighting did not work at all in the jungles of Vietnam. The Vietnamese resorted to guerrilla warfare like they had against the Chinese, and they drove out the Mongolians rather quickly. Vietnam was able to inflict unexpectedly high casualties on the Mongols. And these people on horseback would make real easy targets for a person in the jungle. I mean, a person could hide in the jungle with nothing more than a dagger. And when a man on a horse approached, he would be invisible because he'd be hiding among the underbrush or the thick vegetation. He could reach out with his dagger, cut down a Mongolian horseman, and then disappear. And the other Mongolians would never know what hit the man. They'd be basically galloping along, and whoops, one of them would drop off his horse dead. They'd go a few feet more, maybe a few hundred feet, gallop along, and another one would drop off dead. And The American troops, by the way, experienced the same thing, similar. The Mongolians had unexpectedly high casualties, and they finally gave up. Korea and Vietnam and Japan, all three set up civil service exams. Unlike though Japan, in Vietnam, any man could take the exam. Now, only men. Again, I do not know if any of these countries ever allowed women to take the exam, but any man in Vietnam could take it. Shintoism never made any headway into Korea or Vietnam. Shintoism here became almost exclusively a Japanese religion, suited to the Japanese islands and suited to the Japanese climate, suited to the Japanese way of life, and was hardly at all adopted by anybody else except for the Japanese. In Vietnam, women could divorce their husbands. This was not necessarily true in a lot of Japan or China. Well, in the case of Japan and China, you can't make a blanket statement. It varied from place to place, from generation to generation. But in Vietnam, their women were more equal than they were in China and in Japan. Now, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, fast forward to the 20th century, the United States was destined to fight wars in all three places. In Japan, we decisively won. In Korea, we fought to a standstill, to a draw. And by the way, I want to say about the Korean War, it never officially ended. All the two sides did was have a truce. And every once in a while, North Korea will fire some shots at South Koreans. And the South Koreans say we're getting tired of it. They never actually do anything about it. But every once in a while, North Korea will get aggressive, fire a few shots at South Korean boats or ships, some South Korean island. Every once in a while, too, a North Korean gunman will kill an American serviceman. It does happen. And so far now, one time in 1968, North Korea captured an American ship. In North Korea's eyes, the war is not over. They just simply agreed to a truce. In the case of Vietnam, the United States lost. You know, we fought Japan first. It's like a progression. Japan first, Korea next, Vietnam last. In the case of Japanese, we knew how to fight, and we fought to win. In the case of Korea, we decided we're going to fight a limited war, and we can't win. In the case of Vietnam, we even kept it more limited. And the United States has not really won a big war since World War II. I said we did win in the Middle East for a time, but then the bad guys came back, and the United States has not been able to put them down. What point am I making? The days of American greatness possibly are over. All right, leaving that. Now, we have about 10 minutes left or so by way of review. India. What wound up becoming the official religion of India, and it happened during this period of time, medieval India? Hinduism. Buddhism threatened. Wound up being Hinduism. Now, in the case of China, what's the primary religion? Buddhism. No, not Buddhism. Even though Buddhism came in. What's China's religion? Confucianism. I mean, what's China's religion in medieval history? In the case of Japan, their official religion is Shintoism. Okay. Who was the Chinese philosopher who said that the way we understand the universe is by understanding ourselves? Wang Yangming. He was a Neo-Confucian. Now, after the fall of the Han Dynasty, China went into a period of chaos, which they remember by what name? The era of, anybody remember? Era of 6 dynasties. Era of 6 dynasties. Who was the founder of the Mongol Empire? You should know this.
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan. What became the official religion of northern India? I'm talking about Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal.
Islam.
What became the religion of most of your civilized people in Southeast Asia? Buddhism. Buddha. All right. The trade route that connected China to the West is known as the Silk Road. Which dynasty after the Han, between the Han and the takeover of communists, which dynasty do people consider the greatest dynasty China had? Between the Han and the communist takeover. The Tang dynasty. Tang. The Grand Canal in China joins which of their 2 rivers? And one of them is named like a river here nearby. 2 rivers such as the Grand Canal joins together the Yellow River and Yangtze. Now, any of you aware that there's a river nearby? It's actually a little creek called the Yellow River. China has a big river called the Yellow River. Yeah, there's a small little creek here nearby called the Yellow River. Have any of you aware of it? In fact, there's a game ranch there called the Yellow River Game Ranch, where they have a lot of deer and a few other animals, groundhog in particular. The Yellow River Game Ranch, or the Yellow River and Yangtze, 2 of China's big rivers. All right. Oh yeah, the main thing that Chinese have liked about Confucianism, it emphasizes hard work and loyalty to the family and loyalty to the state. And this is the main thing it has going for it, hard work. It also emphasizes the practical, with not a lot of emphasis on spiritual matters. The practical, hard work, loyalty to your family. When the Chinese were taken over by the Mongolians, what dynasty was in power in China? Song dynasty. It's spelled S-O-N-G. Pronounced, I believe, Song, S-O-O-N-G. All right. What city became, and this is something I did not mention, folks, what city became the capital of China? This is the It still is, by the way. Beijing. Now, I had a brother ask me one time, we always were taught the capital of China was Peking. He said, when did Peking become Beijing? If someone were to ask you that, you know the answer. When did Peking become Beijing? It's when we Westerners began to be more enlightened and more educated in how these local people are pronouncing their own city. It always has been called Beijing. And we Westerners mistook it for Peking, but actually it's always been Beijing. Just like the Quran was always spelled Quran in Arabic, we spelled it Koran, but we eventually learned that, hey, this is the way they do it in their country. As we become more enlightened, we start doing things their way more and more. But it was always Beijing. Of the groups of people we've talked about in these three lessons, in chapters 9, 10, and 11, which group contained the most diversified people that we talked about? The people of what part of the world?
Korea.
Not Korea. They were like Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia. About not being diversified, the Japanese, down through history, have never encouraged foreigners to come in and settle.